I was halfway through a 3-day business trip in Chicago when my phone lit up with 12 missed calls from my mother. The 13th came in before I could even process the screen, and her voice, frantic and trembling, said, "It's Grandpa. He collapsed. You need to come home immediately." My heart dropped into my stomach, but something in her tone felt rehearsed, like she was reading lines from a script she'd practiced. I asked where Grandpa was, which hospital, and she dodged the question. "Just come. Don't waste time asking questions. Family comes first." That was always her refrain. Those 3 words she wielded like a chain around my neck. Family comes first. I booked the earliest return flight I could find, ignoring the fact that leaving the conference would sabotage months of preparation and millions in potential contracts. On the plane, I couldn't shake the unease. My grandfather was 86, yes, but he was stubbornly healthy. The kind of man who still jogged around the neighborhood at dawn, lecturing the younger neighbors about heart rates and discipline. The idea of him suddenly collapsing felt convenient. My gut told me I was flying into a storm, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered when I landed. When I rushed from the airport, suitcase still in hand, I expected flashing ambulance, lights, or at least a quiet house filled with tension. Instead, I walked straight into chaos, but not the kind I imagined. Grandpa was sitting on the porch, alive, healthy, and very much confused as to why I nearly tackled him in a hug. He looked at me with raised brows, saying, "What on earth are you doing back so soon? Don't you have that big meeting?" My mother appeared behind him, her face pale for a split second before she forced a smile. "Oh, sweetheart, there must have been some miscommunication. Grandpa had a dizzy spell, but he's fine now." My stomach twisted because I knew exactly what this was. I had abandoned my trip, my clients, my deals, not for Grandpa's health, but for her scheme. Inside the house, I noticed files spread across the dining table, thick folders, contracts, and the telltale seal of our company's bank, my family. Business wasn't small. It was the foundation of our lives, the empire my grandfather had built with his own hands. 4 decades of sweat and sacrifice were in those papers, and in the middle of them, all sat my mother, pen in hand, phone buzzing with voices that spoke of wiring funds, transfers, and access codes. I froze in the doorway as I heard the number, 4.2 million. That was no small mistake. That was intentional. My own mother had used Grandpa's name, forged his emergency authorization, and moved to reroute almost everything he had reserved for company growth into her private accounts. I stood there stunned, realizing I had been lured away from Chicago, not because Grandpa needed me, but because she needed me gone. The moment I left town, she staged the collapse, rallied fake urgency, and swooped into the company's offices to claim authority while I was miles away. My chest pounded as she turned to me, pretending nothing was wrong, saying, "Since you're here, darling, help me with these documents." I had always known my mother valued power above all else, but to see her calmly attempt to gut the very business her father had built while hiding behind lies about his health, it snapped something deep inside me. I didn't say a word at first, just stared at her with the weight of every betrayal she'd ever committed stacking in my chest. She was talking quickly now, sliding folders toward me, as if I were her assistant instead of her daughter, explaining with fake patience that the market is volatile and we need to secure family assets. But I wasn't hearing strategy. I was hearing theft, and I could see Grandpa's bewildered face in the background as he tried to understand what his own daughter was orchestrating behind his back. My mother had always been calculating, but she wrapped her schemes in the language of loyalty. When I was younger, she'd push me into bailing out my brother's debt or covering her lavish parties, telling me, "You're the responsible one. You can handle it." It's what family does. Every time, it left me drained and humiliated. But I told myself, maybe one day she would stop. That day never came. The more successful I became in the company, the more ruthless she grew. I worked 16-hour days to modernize Grandpa's factories, to open new markets abroad, to negotiate contracts that made our business a competitor in industries we once only dreamed of. But every success I had, she tried to twist into her own leverage. At first, it was small, asking me to sign documents, just for bookkeeping, or to attend meetings where she suddenly positioned herself as the decision maker. Then it escalated. She forged my digital signature once, on a supplier agreement, and brushed it off when I confronted her. "You're overreacting. I did it for us." But nothing compared to this. $4.2 million, siphoned into shadow accounts, all while she spun a story about Grandpa on his deathbed, to drag me away from the only protection the company had, me. My blood ran cold, as I realized that if I hadn't caught the next flight home, she might have succeeded. The contracts on the table weren't hypothetical. They were already in process. The wires were pending, and a few signatures stood between my mother and a financial massacre that could cripple the company overnight. I finally found my voice, low but sharp. "You lied. Grandpa's fine. You tried to take everything while I was gone." She flinched, but recovered quickly, plastering on a mask of offended innocence. "How dare you accuse me of that? I was only protecting our legacy. You don't understand how this world works." That was her favorite weapon, gaslighting me, making me feel small, as though my years of dedication, of grinding to keep our company afloat, meant nothing, because she had the title of mother. But this time, I didn't fold. I looked at Grandpa, who was gripping the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white, his lips pressed tight. He wasn't confused anymore. He was furious, and that fury mirrored my own. The next morning, I didn't go into the office as usual. Instead, I spent hours combing through the company's internal records, calling the bank, demanding statements, and pulling up every wire request made in the last 72 hours. What I found confirmed my worst suspicion. My mother had already initiated multiple transfers, each split into smaller amounts to avoid immediate detection, routed through shell accounts that traced back to her longtime consultants. I printed everything: names, account numbers, timestamps, the full paper trail. Each page was like a knife twisting deeper, proof that she had orchestrated this long before. I stepped onto that plane to Chicago. Grandpa's supposed emergency was nothing but the final distraction she needed. I sat at the kitchen table with the stack of evidence in front of me, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from a cold, controlled rage. Grandpa shuffled in quietly, still wearing his morning cardigan, his face tight with unease. When he saw the papers, his jaw tightened. I slid them across to him without a word. He read in silence, his lips moving as his eyes scanned the figures. And then he looked up at me with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. "My daughter," he whispered, voice cracking. "She would gut her own father's work." His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of betrayal, decades in the making. Meanwhile, my mother waltzed in, hair perfectly styled, carrying her tablet like the queen of an empire she hadn't earned. "Good, you're both up," she chirped, pretending not to notice the storm in the room. "We need to finalize the paperwork before the end of the week. Timing is critical." She started shuffling through the contracts again, until Grandpa slammed his palm on the table, the sound echoing through the house. She froze. He stood, his voice trembling with rage. "You lied to me, you lied to her, and you tried to steal what I bled for." For the first time in my life, I saw my mother falter, her confidence cracking as she stammered about securing assets and doing what was best for the family. But her theatrics didn't sway me anymore. I had evidence, I had timing, and most importantly, I had resolve. That evening, instead of confronting her further in private, I took the entire stack of documents and drove straight to our company's legal department. By midnight, emergency meetings were set, locks were changed on all digital authorizations, and the board was alerted. I wasn't just reacting to her scheme, I was dismantling it. She thought she had outsmarted me with her fake emergency, but in reality, she had exposed herself at the most critical moment. The next day, the company would wake up to a new reality. one where her access was severed and her fraud exposed. By dawn the following day, I was no longer the dutiful daughter, running damage control. I was the acting head of the company, and I intended to prove it. With the lawyers and compliance officers by my side, I walked into headquarters before most employees had even arrived. The moment my keycard hit the scanner, the system recognized the updated authorization we'd filed overnight. My mother's credentials, disabled. Her office, locked. Her personal assistant tried to greet me nervously, asking if Mrs. Lawrence would be arriving soon, and I simply said, "Not anymore." By 8 o'clock, a memo went out to every employee. Temporary restructuring of leadership, citing suspicious financial activity under investigation. Within hours, whispers spread like wildfire through the corridors, but I kept my head high and my steps steady. At 10 sharp, my mother stormed through the lobby, heels clicking like gunfire against the marble floor. She was still dressed in her immaculate tailored suit, clutching her tablet like it was a sword, and demanding to know who had authorized this nonsense. Security, instructed by legal counsel, stopped her at the elevators. The look on her face when her badge failed to grant access, pure fury, the kind that strips away every mask. She spotted me across the atrium and hissed my name loud enough for half the staff to hear. "You think you can do this to me, to your own mother?" The room fell silent, employees frozen between shock and curiosity. I didn't shout back. Instead, I held up the thick file of bank statements and contracts in front of her, my voice calm, deliberate. "This isn't about you being my mother. This is about you trying to rob the company of $4.2 million. The board was already gathered upstairs, waiting. When she tried to push past security, I invited her, coldly, to join the meeting. Inside that boardroom, surrounded by 12 members who had served with my grandfather for decades, I laid every piece of evidence on the table: transaction logs, forged authorizations, even phone recordings from the bank where she impersonated Grandpa's authority. Each detail landed like a hammer blow. My mother tried to spin excuses, weaving elaborate stories about strategic repositioning and protecting against foreign acquisitions. But no one bought it, especially not when Grandpa himself walked into the room, leaning on his cane, but standing taller than I'd seen him in years. He didn't say much, just one sentence that cut through her lies like a blade. "You've lost my trust." Her face drained of color. She knew what that meant. Without Grandpa's backing, without the board's faith, she had no foothold left. And me, I wasn't the naive daughter anymore. Overnight, I had shifted from her scapegoat to the company's shield, and there was no going back. That evening, after the boardroom confrontation, the company felt like it had been split in two. Half of the employees were stunned that the drama they'd only heard whispers about was real. The other half looked at me with a quiet kind of relief, as if someone had finally put a stop to the storm they'd endured for years. My mother had always projected herself as untouchable, parading through the halls like a queen who owned every brick and tile. But now her empire had crumbled in a matter of hours. The security team escorted her out of headquarters, her shouts and echoing across the lobby, while I stayed upstairs, signing emergency authorizations, freezing suspicious accounts, and working with our attorneys to file injunctions before a single stolen dollar could vanish overseas. The phone rang non-stop. Bank officials, investors, suppliers, everyone wanted answers. I gave them what they needed: concise explanations backed by hard evidence. I didn't paint my mother as a villain in public, not yet. I framed her actions as an internal breach, under investigation, and positioned myself as the stabilizing force. Behind closed doors, however, the truth was undeniable. The $4.2 million wasn't just an attempted theft. It was a carefully plotted extraction that had been weeks in the making. The forged authorizations, the shell accounts, even the fake emergency call. Every step had been engineered with precision. But she underestimated me. She thought she could manipulate me, like she always had, pulling me home with fear and guilt. She never realized that fear had turned into steel long ago. That night, I drove home exhausted, but unshaken, only to find her waiting in the driveway. Her car was parked crookedly, headlights still on, and she stood there with her arms crossed, eyes blazing. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she demanded. "You humiliated me in front of the board. You've destroyed our family. Name!" I stepped out of the car slowly, keeping my voice low. "I didn't destroy anything. You did the moment you forged Grandpa's signature." She lunged forward, hissing that I was ungrateful, that she had sacrificed everything for me, that the money was rightfully ours. I let her rant, let her words spill into the night air. But inside, I felt nothing but clarity. For the first time, I understood that she wasn't acting out of desperation or love for family. She was acting out of greed, pure and simple. And I wasn't going to let her drag me, or Grandpa, or the company into her darkness any longer. 2 days later, the fallout began to spread beyond the walls of our house and the company. Word leaked, first quietly through industry contacts, then loudly through financial circles, that a major fraud attempt had been uncovered. The number attached to it, $4.2 million, made headlines. Reporters began circling. Investors demanded reassurances, and suddenly every move I made carried the weight of public scrutiny. My mother hated that more than anything. She thrived on reputation, on the illusion of control, and now that illusion was shattered. She called me relentlessly, switching between threats and pleas. One moment telling me I would regret humiliating her, the next sobbing about how she only wanted security for the family. I stopped answering after the 5th call. Inside the company, I pushed forward. I met with the bank's fraud department, handed them every document, every recording, every forged authorization. They were stunned by the detail, but it meant one thing. My mother could no longer spin this as a misunderstanding. Legally, it was fraud, criminal fraud. The lawyers laid it out in plain terms. Charges could be filed within weeks, and the board was already leaning toward full cooperation with investigators. Grandpa, once heartbroken, now became quietly resolute. He called me into his study late at night, his voice low but firm, and said, "You will carry this company now, not her, never her again." That moment, hearing the man who built everything hand me the reins with unshakable conviction, sealed it. I wasn't acting as a scared daughter anymore. I was acting as the rightful heir and protector of what he had created. But my mother wasn't finished. That same night, she showed up at the house again, pounding on the door like a woman possessed. When I opened it, she pushed past me, her eyes bloodshot, her voice raw from screaming. "You think you can erase me? You think you can take what is mine?" She grabbed my arm, nails digging into my skin, and I yanked free, holding her gaze. Without flinching. "It was never yours. You tried to steal it, and now everyone knows." Her face twisted into something I'll never forget. Rage, fear, and a flicker of desperation. For the first time, she realized the control she had wielded my whole life was gone. She couldn't guilt me, she couldn't scare me, and she certainly couldn't undo the evidence already in motion. All she had left was fury, and I let her burn in it as I shut the door in her face. The investigation moved faster than even I expected. Within a week, federal agents contacted the company's legal team, requesting interviews and access to records. I handed over everything, down to the email timestamps, where my mother pretended to be Grandpa. There was no hiding anymore. The board voted unanimously to suspend her permanently, stripping her of any authority she once held. By the following Monday, she received official notice. The company she had tried to gut no longer recognized her as part of leadership. It was the first time in her life she had been publicly dethroned, and the humiliation cut deeper than any prison sentence ever could. But it didn't stop there. Banks began freezing her personal accounts pending investigation. Business partners quietly backed away, whispering about her betrayal. And socially, the glamorous luncheons and charity galas, where she once glowed as the star guest stopped sending invitations. Overnight, she became a pariah. I watched all of it unfold, not with triumph, but with a strange calm. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about screaming or gloating. It was about standing still while the truth did the work for you. At home, Grandpa seemed lighter, as though the weight of years of denial had lifted. He spent mornings in his study again, reviewing plans with me, teaching me the finer details of contracts he had once handled alone. "You've got the instinct," he told me quietly one evening, sliding across a notebook filled with his handwriting. "I should have trusted you sooner." His approval didn't erase the years of being dismissed, of being treated as expendable by my own mother, but it meant something real, that I had finally broken the cycle she had tried to trap me in. Meanwhile, my mother's rage turned frantic. She left me voicemails at 3 a.m, alternating between cursing me as a traitor and begging me to intervene before law enforcement took action. "We're family," she hissed in one message. "Family doesn't destroy each other." But the irony of her words only made me stronger. She had destroyed that bond long ago when she put greed before blood, and now she was finally facing the reality of her own choices. The night the police came to her house with a warrant, I didn't celebrate. I simply sat at Grandpa's side, holding the notebook he'd given me, and watched the news trickle in. It wasn't the end yet, but it was the beginning of a reckoning she could no longer escape. The first court hearing was surreal. My mother arrived in a cream-colored suit, as if she were attending a brunch instead of facing charges of fraud and embezzlement. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions, and she tried to hold her chin high like none of it could touch her. But inside, it was different. Inside, the judge read out every accusation, every document, every transfer slip that bore her name or her forged signature. I sat behind the company's legal team, silent but unmovable, as the evidence unfolded like a map of her greed. Each number, each account, was a nail sealing the coffin of her carefully curated image. She tried to argue, of course, claimed it was a misunderstanding, that she had been protecting Grandpa's interests, that I had manipulated the board against her. But the prosecutor brought out the recordings, her voice pretending to be Grandpa, authorizing transfers he knew nothing about. The room went cold when those words played aloud. Even her attorney looked down at the table, unable to defend the indefensible. Grandpa himself sat beside me, his cane resting across his knees, his eyes glistening but resolute. He didn't speak in court, but his presence was louder than anything I could have said. Outside the courtroom, the company began to stabilize under my leadership. I renegotiated contracts she had nearly destroyed, restored investor confidence, and cut ties with the consultants she had funneled money through. Employees who had once looked at me as merely the daughter now began treating me as the leader I had become overnight. There was respect in their eyes that hadn't been there before, and I carried it carefully, not letting pride cloud the responsibility I held. Every decision I made was deliberate, not just for the company's survival, but for its future. My mother, however, refused to accept her downfall. She cornered me in the courthouse hallway one afternoon, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with rage. "You think you've won. You think taking this company makes you powerful. You're nothing without me. I made you strong." I looked her straight in the eye, calm as ever. "No, you made me survive. There's a difference." She recoiled like I'd struck her, because for the first time, I wasn't the daughter begging for approval. I was the woman who no longer needed it. That night, I drove back to headquarters and stood in the empty boardroom, looking out at the city lights. The company was mine now, not by inheritance, not by manipulation, but by choice and by battle. And as much as my mother tried to claw her way back into relevance, she no longer had a place in the empire she once tried to steal. Weeks stretched into months, and the case against my mother only grew stronger. Investigators traced not only the $4.2 million she had attempted to siphon, but also smaller irregularities over the years. Little leaks of money disguised as consulting fees and event budgets. The total climbed higher than anyone had expected, painting a picture of long-term betrayal rather than one desperate act. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a predator who had been feeding off the company quietly until she got bold enough to take it all. The press devoured every headline, and her name, once associated with charity galas and business luncheons, became synonymous with greed. Meanwhile, inside the company, I began to transform what she had nearly destroyed. I reorganized departments, installed new compliance systems, and personally met with each major partner to restore trust. For the first time in years, morale was rising. Employees walked the halls without fear of sudden firings or manipulative orders whispered from the top. Grandpa watched me carefully, sometimes with tears in his eyes, sometimes with a proud smile he couldn't hide. One evening, he told me, "You didn't just save this company, you saved its soul." Those words meant more than any contract I had ever signed. My mother's desperation turned venomous. She began giving interviews outside the courthouse, blaming me, calling me a traitor who had orchestrated a coup against her own blood. But the more she spoke, the more she revealed her bitterness, and the public stopped sympathizing. The image she had spent decades polishing was gone, replaced by the truth she couldn't control anymore. And I didn't have to respond. Silence became my weapon. Every time she screamed to the world that I had ruined her, I let the evidence, the board and the courts speak louder than I ever could. The day came when she realized she had lost everything. Her accounts frozen, her friends vanished, her reputation shredded. She showed up at Grandpa's house, not with rage this time, but with hollow eyes and a voice so small I barely recognized it. "I just wanted to be secure," she whispered, as if that could erase the trail of destruction she had left. Grandpa looked at her for a long time, then shook his head. Security built on lies is no security at all. He closed the door gently, and I stood behind him, feeling the finality of it settle over us. She was no longer a part of our lives. Not in business, not in family, not in legacy. By the time the trial officially began, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches. Cameras lined the steps outside, and the air buzzed with the anticipation of a scandal finally reaching its peak. My mother walked in, with her head still held high, but the defiance in her eyes had dulled. She was no longer the untouchable matriarch. She was a defendant facing charges that carried years of prison time. The prosecutor laid it all out in brutal detail. Every fraudulent transfer, every forged signature, every phone call where she had pretended to be Grandpa. The jury listened intently, some shaking their heads as the evidence mounted. I sat quietly behind our legal team, steady and unflinching, my presence a reminder that her lies hadn't destroyed me. They had built me into someone stronger. Her defense tried everything. They painted her as a misunderstood woman overwhelmed by responsibility, a victim of miscommunication, even a loving mother unfairly targeted by her ambitious daughter. But the documents didn't lie, and neither did the bank officials who testified. When one of them confirmed under oath that she had impersonated Grandpa's voice to authorize a transfer, the room went silent. I watched her face carefully, searching for even a flicker of remorse. But all I saw was calculation, the wheels turning, still searching for someone else to blame. Outside the trial, my life had shifted completely. I was no longer just protecting the company from collapse. I was reshaping it. New partnerships bloomed. Investors, once hesitant, now praised our resilience. And employees began calling me, not just the boss's daughter, but the leader we needed. It wasn't easy. The hours were brutal. The pressure relentless, but for the first time, it felt like the company truly belonged to someone who cared about its future, not just its money. The verdict didn't come that day, but everyone in the room felt the direction it was heading. As we left the courthouse, a reporter shouted at me, "Do you think justice will be served?" I paused, looked straight into the camera, and said calmly, "Justice isn't about revenge, it's about truth, and the truth is finally out." Those words spread across headlines by nightfall, and for the first time, the narrative wasn't about her scandal, it was about my strength. That evening, Grandpa sat with me in the study, his hand resting gently over mine. "You've done what I never had the courage to do," he said softly. "You stood up to her, and you saved everything we built." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the stack of documents, the same ones that had once broken my heart, and realized they had become the foundation of my freedom. The day of the verdict arrived like a storm cloud hanging over the city. The courthouse was swarmed by reporters, their microphones stretching like claws toward anyone connected to the case. I walked in quietly, dressed in a simple navy suit, no jewelry, no spectacle. My mother, on the other hand, appeared in a pristine, white dress, as though trying to stage herself as some sort of martyr. She looked around the courtroom with that same performative poise she had carried all my life, but her eyes betrayed her, darting, restless, terrified of the one thing she could never control anymore: the truth. The jury filed in after hours of deliberation, their faces grave. My chest tightened as the foreman stood, but I forced myself to stay steady, my hands folded in my lap. One by one, the charges were read: fraud, forgery, embezzlement, guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word fell like a hammer, stripping away the last shreds of her carefully built image. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just sat there frozen, her mask finally cracked beyond repair. The judge's voice rang out with the sentence: multiple years in prison, fines, restitution, and a permanent ban from serving in any corporate capacity again. My mother, the woman who had once ruled over everyone with an iron grip, was led out in handcuffs, cameras flashing as the world watched her fall. I didn't celebrate. I simply sat there, breathing slowly, letting the weight of it sink in. It wasn't victory, it was closure. For years she had controlled me with guilt, fear, and manipulation, but now the power she once wielded was gone, stripped bare by her own choices. As she passed me in the aisle, her eyes met mine for the briefest second. There was no apology, no recognition, just a hollow glare that told me she still couldn't accept the truth. And yet, it didn't matter anymore. She no longer had a place in my life, or in the company, or in Grandpa's legacy. Outside, reporters swarmed, shouting questions. How do you feel? Do you think justice was done? I stopped only once, my voice calm, almost serene. Justice isn't about destroying someone. It's about protecting what they tried to take. Today, that protection was secured. The clip went viral by evening, painting not just the story of her downfall, but of my resolve. That night, Grandpa and I sat in silence by the fireplace, the trial behind us at last. He handed me his old signet ring, the one he had worn at every major deal he had ever made. "You are the future now," he said quietly. And for the first time in years, I felt the knot in my chest unravel. The war was over, the company was safe, and I was free. In the weeks after the sentencing, the world adjusted to the new reality. For the first time in decades, the company ran without my mother's shadow, looming over every decision. Investors who had once been on edge doubled down. Contracts that were wavering suddenly moved forward, and employees walked into the office each morning with a renewed sense of stability. It wasn't just business that had shifted, it was the atmosphere. People no longer lowered their voices in hallways, no longer worried about who might suddenly be cut out of a project because of her whims. There was air to breathe again. I spent those weeks working relentlessly, not because I was afraid of losing momentum, but because I wanted to rebuild what she had nearly destroyed. Every late night at the office, every strategy meeting, every handshake with a partner was a way of reclaiming the ground she had scorched. And slowly, piece by piece, it began to pay off. Profits stabilized, morale soared, and I started to feel what it meant to lead, not through fear, but through trust. Grandpa watched it all with quiet pride. Though age had slowed his steps, his mind was sharp, and his advice was invaluable. At times, he would simply sit in the boardroom during meetings, saying nothing until the end, then offer a single piece of wisdom that cut straight to the heart of the issue. His presence reminded everyone of the legacy we were protecting. My mother, meanwhile, faded into the background of our lives, her name appearing only in occasional news articles about her appeal attempts or prison conditions. At first, I braced myself for the wave of guilt I thought might come, but it never did. Instead, I felt a profound clarity. She had chosen her path, step by step, and I had simply chosen to stop walking in it with her. For years, she had told me family comes first, weaponizing those words to control me. But now I finally understood. Family only comes first when it's built on respect, not manipulation. One evening, after a particularly long day, I stood on the balcony of the office, overlooking the city lights. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's story. This was mine now, Not just the company, not just the victory, but the freedom to define who I was, beyond her shadow. I realized then that revenge hadn't been about taking her down. It had been about lifting myself up, about proving that I could stand tall, even when she tried to cut me down. And in that moment, with the city sprawling before me, and the company's future secure, I finally felt the weight slide off my shoulders. I was no longer her daughter trying to earn approval. I was the woman who had taken the company overnight and built something untouchable from the ashes she left behind. Months turned into a year, and with every quarter that passed, the company grew stronger under my leadership. What had once been an empire on the edge of collapse became a model of resilience, written about in business journals as a case study in recovery. It wasn't just about the numbers, though they were better than ever. It was about culture. I had dismantled the hierarchy of fear my mother had cultivated, replacing it with transparency and accountability. Decisions were no longer made behind closed doors, with whispered threats. They were made in the open, with input from people who had been silenced for years. The change was palpable. Employees who once kept their heads down now spoke up with ideas, and those ideas turned into innovations that propelled us forward faster than I ever imagined. At home, Grandpa's health began to decline, but his spirit never faltered. He often reminded me, "It's not the company that matters most. It's what you do with it." He spent his evenings telling me stories of how he built it from nothing, how he once pawned his watch to pay workers during the first tough winter, and how he never regretted a single sacrifice, because he believed in building something bigger than himself. One night, he looked at me with tired eyes, but a steady smile, and said, "I know it's safe with you. You won't waste it the way she tried to." His trust was the greatest inheritance he could have given me, and I carried it with pride. As for my mother, prison had stripped away everything she once used to define herself. Her wealth, her social circle, her carefully crafted image. Occasionally, letters arrived from her, written in handwriting I barely recognized. Some were filled with bitterness, accusing me of betrayal. Others were rambling attempts at apologies. I never responded. I had learned that not every story needs a reconciliation, and not every wound needs to be reopened. My closure had come not from her words, but from my own choices. One evening, after a long board meeting, I walked past the portraits that lined the hallway. Photos of Grandpa in his early years, snapshots of milestones, even one of my mother in her prime. For the first time, I didn't feel anger when I looked at her picture. I just felt distance. She was part of the past, a chapter I had survived, not a force that defined me anymore. I had stepped out from her shadow completely. Standing there, I realized that my revenge had never been about seeing her fall. It had been about rising, about proving to myself that I could survive her lies, her manipulations, and her greed, and come out stronger than she ever imagined. And in that realization, I finally felt free. The second year after the trial marked a turning point I hadn't fully anticipated. The company was not only stable, it was thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible when I first walked into that boardroom with trembling hands and a stack of evidence. We had expanded into 2 new markets, launched a product line that bore my personal stamp of vision, and for the first time in decades, we were debt-free. Industry leaders invited me to speak at conferences. Magazines profiled me as one of the most resilient CEOs of the year, and investors used our story as proof that companies could survive even the most corrosive betrayals if led with integrity. None of that mattered as much as walking through the office each morning, seeing faces lift with real smiles, hearing laughter in places where silence had once been enforced by fear. That was the real proof of change. Grandpa's health declined steadily, and I knew time was running out. He spent most of his days in his study, too frail to come into the office, but always asking for updates. I brought him reports, sometimes even live-streamed board meetings, so he could feel included. One evening, when I showed him a new project we had just secured, his eyes shone with pride. "You've done more than save it," he whispered, voice breaking. "You've built it into something even I couldn't have dreamed." It was the last time he spoke to me with that clarity. And a few weeks later, he passed quietly in his sleep. The loss carved me open, but it also cemented my responsibility. His legacy was no longer a weight. It was a compass, guiding me every step forward. The press tried to connect his death to my mother, to spin stories about how family tragedies defined our history, but I refused to let her shadow linger any longer. When asked about her, I gave the same answer every time. The company is about the future, not the past. Behind bars, her attempts at appeals kept failing. Once, I saw her on the news, being escorted through a hallway in prison blues. Her face hollow, her hair dull and lifeless. The woman who once dictated every corner of my life now looked like a stranger. For the first time, I felt something close to pity, but it didn't last. Choices had consequences, and she was living in the world she had built with her own hands. As for me, I built a new rhythm. The company became not just a business, but a platform. I funded scholarships in Grandpa's name, created mentorship programs for young women entering industries where they were told they didn't belong, and made transparency the cornerstone of every policy. People called it philanthropy. I called it reclamation. Every act of generosity, every structure of fairness, was a way of undoing the damage she had caused. Not by erasing it, but by growing something better in its place. And in quiet moments, when I stood on the rooftop garden of our headquarters, looking out at the skyline, I thought about how far I had come from that terrified woman on a plane, rushing home to a supposed emergency. She thought she had outplayed me then, but she didn't understand the one thing she could never control: my resolve. In trying to steal everything, she had given me the one gift she never intended: freedom from her grip, and the fire to become more than she ever was. It's strange how life comes full circle. When I think back to that frantic phone call on my business trip, my mother's voice shaking as she claimed Grandpa had collapsed, I can still feel the knot of dread in my stomach. That one lie was supposed to be my downfall, the distraction that let her strip the company bare, but it became the turning point that changed everything. I lost my illusions that day, but in losing them, I found the strength I had been denying myself for years. Grandpa's passing left a hollow space in my heart, but he also left me with something greater than grief: clarity. He had trusted me with his life's work, not because I was his daughter, but because I had proven I could protect it when it mattered most. Every time I step into the boardroom now, I carry his presence with me. The signet ring he gave me before he passed rests on my finger, a reminder that I am not just preserving his legacy, I am expanding it. My mother remains behind bars. Occasionally, the news mentions her when another appeal is denied, or when journalists revisit our story to analyze the scandal that shook the business world. People sometimes ask if I plan to visit her, if I'll forgive her. The truth is simple: forgiveness is irrelevant. She is no longer part of my life. The ties of blood were severed the moment she chose greed over family, deceit over trust. I don't hate her anymore. Hatred is just another chain. I've moved beyond her shadow, and that is my victory. In the years since, I have built something she never could. A company rooted in respect, not fear. A legacy defined by growth, not manipulation. We've expanded globally, invested in sustainable industries, and created opportunities for thousands of people whose lives are better, because we refuse to let corruption win. That, more than profits or headlines, is what I'm proud of. Sometimes, late at night, I stand in the quiet lobby of headquarters, looking up at the portrait of Grandpa that hangs above the staircase. The lights cast a golden glow over his steady eyes, and I imagine what he would say if he could see us now. I think he would smile, not because the company survived, but because I did. Because I finally became the woman he always knew I could be, even when I doubted myself. My story isn't one of destruction. It's one of reclamation. My mother tried to take everything, but in the end, she gave me the chance to claim the future as my own. She faked an emergency to steal millions, but I took the company overnight and built something she could never touch. And as I walk forward, now stronger, freer, and unafraid, I know this with certainty: revenge wasn't about her downfall. It was about my rise.